fire reached the roof of the house before Alara Voss even understood what was happening. Smoke rolled across the narrow street, thick and black, swallowing the moonlight whole. She heard boots pounding on packed earth, and beneath that sound, something worse. A low growl, deep enough to shake the wooden shutters, rolling from somewhere close, somewhere near the well where the children used to play. Her grandmother's hand closed around her wrist, pulling her down behind the collapsed cart that had once carried vegetables to market. Old Win's face was streaked with soot, her gray hair loose and wild, but her eyes were steady, the way they always were, even now, even with the village burning around them. "Listen to me," Win whispered, her voice cracking but firm. "Take the ash from the hearth. Rub it on your neck, your wrists, behind your ears. Do it now." Ilara's hands were shaking so hard she could barely scoop the cold gray powder from the overturned bucket beside them, but she did it anyway, because her grandmother had taught her this ritual since she was a small child, back when it seemed like nothing more than an old woman's superstition. Ash and crushed bitterroot, rubbed deep into the skin, could hide a person's scent from anything that hunted by nose, wolves included, especially wolves. "Why now?" Alara asked, though some part of her already understood the answer. The howls were closer. 3 of them, maybe 4, weaving together in a chorus that made her stomach twist into a hard, cold knot. "Because they are not here for grain or coin," Win said. "They are hunting people tonight, and I will not let them find you." The vegetable cart shuddered as something heavy slammed into a nearby building. Ilara flinched, smearing ash across her collarbone with trembling fingers. Through the gaps in the broken wood, she could see shapes moving through the smoke, tall and broad-shouldered, some walking on 2 legs, some on 4, all of them wearing the black and silver markings of the Fenwick Pack, a rival clan that had raided the border villages twice before, but never like this, never with fire and this much hunger in their howls. Win shoved a small leather pouch into Ilara's hands. More of the mixture, tied tight, enough for many days if she used it sparingly. "Go to the hills," Win said. "Follow the dry riverbed until you reach the cliffs. There is a cave behind the waterfall where your mother used to hide when she was young. Wait there. Do not come back for me." Ilara's throat closed around a sound that was half protest, half sob. "I am not leaving you." Win's hand cupped her face, ash-streaked and trembling but gentle. "You are the last of this family, child. I have lived my years. You have not yet begun to live yours. Now go, before I have to watch you die alongside me instead of living because of me." There was no time to argue further. A shadow fell over the cart, and Win rose to meet it, pushing Ilara toward the gap in the fence with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so frail. Ilara stumbled backward into the dark, tears cutting clean lines through the ash on her cheeks, and the last thing she heard as she ran was her grandmother's voice, steady and clear even as the growling grew louder, telling the shadow that there was nothing left in this house worth taking. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out beneath her, collapsing into the dry riverbed exactly as Win had described, gravel biting into her palms, the sound of the burning village fading slowly behind her into the vast, indifferent quiet of the mountains. She did not look back. She could not make herself look back, because looking back meant seeing the orange glow against the night sky, meant knowing what that glow had already taken from her. The waterfall was smaller than she expected, a thin ribbon of water sliding down dark rock into a shallow pool, but the cave behind it was real, just as her grandmother had promised, a narrow crack in the stone wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. Ilara pressed herself into the darkness and waited, soaked and shivering, listening to every sound the night offered, certain that any moment the growling would find her again. It did not come. Hours passed, marked only by the slow shift of moonlight across the pool outside, and eventually Ilara understood that she was, for the first time in her life, entirely alone. She stayed in the mountains for 3 days before hunger forced her to move. She rationed the ash carefully, reapplying it each morning the way her grandmother had shown her, working it into every place where scent tended to gather, learning through trial and instinct which parts of her body needed the most careful attention. She discovered that hunger made her careless, that fear made her forget the ritual some mornings, until she caught herself and corrected the mistake with shaking hands. On the 4th day, she came across the remains of a hunting camp, abandoned in haste, and found a knife, a length of rope, and half a sack of dried meat left behind by whoever had been there before her. She took all of it without hesitation. Survival, she was learning quickly, did not leave room for guilt. She thought often about what Win had told her over the years, stories that Ilara had once dismissed as bedtime tales meant to frighten children into obedience. Wolves lived by scent the way other people lived by sight, Win used to say. A wolf could track a person across a forest, across a mountain range, across years, simply by remembering the particular note of someone's presence in the air. It was said that some of the oldest and strongest wolves, the ones who ruled entire packs from thrones built on old stone, could recognize a single person's scent among thousands, could find someone they wanted no matter how far that person ran. Elara had asked her grandmother once why she knew so much about wolves and their ways, and Wynne had only smiled, a sad, distant smile, and said that once, a very long time ago, she had loved someone who ran with a pack, and that love had taught her lessons she wished she had never needed to learn. Elara understood now, walking alone through unfamiliar hills with ash drying on her skin and grief sitting heavy in her chest, exactly why her grandmother had never let those lessons go to waste. She traveled south, away from the border villages, away from anywhere the Fenwick pack might still be searching for survivors, and away, she hoped, from any other pack that might catch her scent along the way. She slept during the brightest hours of the day when it was safest to rest in the open, and she moved mostly at dusk and dawn, when the light was too dim for easy tracking but not so dark that she risked breaking an ankle on uneven ground. Villages became more frequent as she moved south, small farming communities tucked into valleys, each one paying tribute to whichever pack claimed the surrounding territory. Elara learned to watch from a distance before approaching any of them, checking for the banners or markings that would tell her which pack held influence there, avoiding anything that looked remotely similar to the black and silver of Fenwick. It was in the 5th week of her journey that she first heard the name Ashwood spoken with a particular kind of reverence, a mixture of fear and respect that she had not heard applied to any other pack territory she had passed through. An old farmer, sharing a fire with her one evening in exchange for help mending a broken cartwheel, told her that the Ashwood throne was ruled by a king who almost never spoke, whose silence unsettled even his own generals, and whose wolves were said to be the most disciplined in the entire region. "They say he can walk through a room of enemies and never say a single word," the farmer told her, poking at the fire with a stick, "and every one of them will still know exactly what he wants from them. His name is Cale Draven, and folks around here call him the Alpha King, though I hear tell his own people rarely call him anything but Sir, because that's about the only word he seems to want to hear." Elara filed the name away without much interest at the time, more concerned with finding steady work and a roof over her head than with the political landscape of pack territories she had no intention of staying in for long. She had a plan, simple and clear in her mind: find somewhere quiet, somewhere far from wolves and their politics, and build a life small enough that no one would ever notice her existing in it. She did not yet know how impossible that plan would prove to be. By the time she reached the outer edges of Ashwood territory, autumn had turned the hills a deep burnt orange, and her supply of ash and bitterroot had dwindled to barely enough for another week of careful use. She had learned to forage for the ingredients herself along the way, but bitterroot in particular grew only in certain soils, and she had not found any since crossing into the eastern hills. The realization sat cold in her stomach as she approached a border camp late one evening, drawn by the smell of cooking fires and the promise, however risky, of food she had not had to hunt or steal herself. She told herself she would only look. She would assess the camp from a distance, decide whether it was safe, and move on if anything seemed wrong. But hunger has a way of shortening a person's patience, and the moment Elara caught sight of a table loaded with bread and dried fish near the edge of the camp, unguarded and steaming in the cool night air, her careful plan collapsed into something far simpler and far more dangerous. She crept closer, keeping to the shadows between supply tents, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain someone would hear it even without a wolf's senses to help them. The camp seemed strangely quiet for a border outpost. Most of its occupants gathered around a large fire near the center, laughing over some story being told by a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down one side of his face. Elara reached the table, closed her fingers around a loaf of bread, and had just begun to retreat into the darkness when a voice behind her, low and completely unhurried, asked a single question that stopped her cold. "And where exactly do you think you are going with that?" She turned, bread still clutched against her chest, and found herself facing a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper blade already drawn, flanked by 2 others who had appeared from the shadows as silently as she had tried to move through them. There was no fire, no howling, none of the chaos of that night in her village, but Elara understood immediately that she had made a mistake, and that this camp, quiet as it seemed, was every bit as dangerous as anything she had faced before. She thought of her grandmother, of the ash still faintly gray against her skin, and wondered, with a strange and sudden clarity, whether she was about to find out just how much protection that old ritual could actually offer her, or whether tonight would be the night it finally failed. The woman with the blade studied her for a long moment, taking in her ragged clothes, the dirt and ash that clung to her skin, the way her hands trembled around the stolen loaf. Something in her expression shifted from suspicion toward a wary sort of curiosity. "You are a strange one," the woman said finally. "Most thieves I catch smell like fear before I even see them coming. You smell like nothing at all." Alara said nothing, unsure whether that observation was meant as a compliment or a warning, and unsure, in the growing silence that followed, which answer would matter more for whatever happened next. Cale Draven stood at the edge of the burned village long after his warriors had finished searching the wreckage, his boots planted in ash that had once been someone's home, his expression unreadable in the pale morning light. He had seen destruction before, had caused a fair share of it himself in the years since he took the throne, but something about this particular scene of ruin unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. 3 of his generals waited a respectful distance behind him, none of them speaking, because they had all learned long ago that the king rarely wanted conversation and never wanted it forced. Cale Draven had earned his reputation not through cruelty, though plenty of rumors painted him that way, but through a discipline so complete that even his closest advisors sometimes forgot the sound of his voice for days at a time. He ruled through presence rather than proclamation, and in the 3 years since he had claimed the Ashwood throne, that presence alone had been enough to keep rival packs at a careful, respectful distance. This village did not belong to Ashwood territory, but it sat close enough to the border that its destruction was, in Cale's mind, effectively a trespass against his own lands. The Fenwick pack had grown bolder over the past year, testing the edges of every territory around them, and this burned collection of homes was the clearest message yet that they intended to keep pushing until someone pushed back. Garrett, one of his generals, finally broke the silence when Cale had said nothing for the better part of an hour. "Survivors are unlikely, sir. Our trackers found blood trails leading in 3 directions, but nothing that suggests anyone escaped alive." Cale did not respond immediately, his attention fixed instead on a set of footprints leading away from a collapsed cart near the edge of what had once been a small garden. The prints were small, likely a young woman or an older child, and they led toward the dry hills to the south, before vanishing entirely at the edge of a rocky slope, where tracking became difficult even for trained eyes. "Send someone to follow that trail," Cale said finally, his voice low but carrying easily across the still morning air. "See how far it goes." Garrett hesitated. "Sir, if there was a survivor, she is likely long gone by now, and our resources would serve better focused on the Fenwick border itself." Cale turned to look at him then, and though his expression barely changed, something in his eyes made Garrett straighten immediately. "I did not ask for your assessment of resources, Garrett. I asked for a tracker." The order was carried out within the hour, though the tracker returned by midday with little to report. The trail had gone cold somewhere in the Rocky Hills, the footprints simply disappearing as though whoever made them had learned, somehow, how to vanish from pursuit entirely. Cale found this more interesting than frustrating, a small puzzle tucked inside a much larger and more urgent problem, and he filed the detail away in the back of his mind the way he filed away most things that did not fit neatly into an explanation. The larger problem, of course, was Fenwick itself, and the growing certainty among his advisors that a confrontation with that pack was no longer a matter of if but when. Cale had spent the ride back to his castle turning the situation over in his mind, weighing the cost of an early strike against the risk of allowing Fenwick to grow bolder still, and by the time the towers of Ashwood came into view against the darkening sky, he had already begun forming the shape of a response, though he shared none of it yet with the generals riding beside him. The Ashwood throne was not a place built for comfort, though it held its own kind of stark beauty, gray stone walls rising from the hillside like something grown from the rock itself rather than built upon it. Cale had never much cared for the softer luxuries some rulers surrounded themselves with, preferring instead the discipline of simple rooms and clear priorities, a preference that had earned him both respect and quiet mockery from nobles who found his tastes strange for a man of his position. He entered the great hall to find his council already assembled, word of the burned village having reached the castle well before his return. Among them sat Ines, his eldest advisor, and one of the few people whose opinion he genuinely valued, her sharp eyes tracking his every movement as he took his place at the head of the long stone table. "You have been quiet even for you," Ines observed, once the rest of the council had settled into their usual arguments about resources and timing. "That tends to mean you are thinking about something none of us have considered yet." Cale allowed himself the smallest hint of something that was not quite a smile. "There was a survivor," he said, his first words to the full council since returning, or at least, there were footprints suggesting one, footprints that our trackers could not follow past a certain point in the hills. Ines raised an eyebrow. "That seems like a minor detail compared to the matter of an entire village burned to the ground." "It would be," Cale agreed, "if it were simply a matter of skilled evasion, But I have hunted enough people in my years to know when a trail goes cold because someone was clever, and when it goes cold because something else is at work. This felt like the latter. The rest of the council seemed inclined to dismiss the observation as an unimportant curiosity, more interested in debating troop numbers and border patrols. But Ines watched her king with the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned, over many years, that Chaol Draven rarely mentioned anything without a reason worth taking seriously. The council session stretched long into the evening, filled with the usual disagreements about how aggressively to respond to Fenwick's growing boldness. Some advisors argued for an immediate show of force, a swift and decisive strike meant to remind the rival pack exactly why Ashwood had never been challenged successfully in living memory. Others urged caution, pointing out that a war fought too hastily could weaken Ashwood's borders elsewhere, leaving them vulnerable to other packs who might see the conflict as an opportunity. Chaol listened to all of it with the same careful patience he brought to every decision, offering little in the way of immediate opinion, though everyone in the room understood that his silence was not indecision but calculation. When he finally spoke, near the end of the session, his words were few but carried the weight of a decision already made, rather than one still being debated. "We will increase patrols along the eastern border immediately," he said, "and we will send word to Fenwick that any further incursion into territory bordering Ashwood will be treated as an act against this throne directly, regardless of whose land it technically belongs to. I want them uncertain of our limits, not confident in them." The council murmured its approval, and the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations as advisors began drafting the specifics of border patrols and diplomatic messages. Chaol remained seated at the head of the table long after most had left, his mind still circling back, unexpectedly, to those small footprints disappearing into rocky hills. He was not a man given to sentiment, and he told himself firmly that his continued thoughts on the matter were simply the product of an unsolved puzzle, rather than any deeper concern for a stranger he had never met and likely never would. Still, before retiring for the evening, he found himself instructing one of his scouts to keep a discreet watch on the southern border camps in case anyone matching the description of a young survivor happened to pass through. It was a small thing, easily justified as thoroughness rather than curiosity, and Chaol allowed himself to believe that explanation without much difficulty, as the days that followed filled with the usual demands of ruling a territory under growing threat. Reports came in steadily regarding Fenwick movement along the border, requiring his attention and leaving little room for thoughts of survivors or footprints. It was nearly 2 weeks later, during a routine review of border camp reports, that a name caught his attention where he had not expected to find one. A young woman, unnamed and unregistered, had been caught stealing food from one of the southern camps and had been detained for questioning by the camp's overseer, a sharp and capable woman named Roran who had served Ashwood loyally for over a decade. Chaol read the brief report twice, his eyes catching on one particular detail that Roran had included almost as an afterthought, clearly uncertain of its significance but including it anyway out of habit. "The woman carries no discernible scent," Roran had written. "My wolves cannot place her, and I have never encountered this before in all my years of service." Something in Chaol's chest tightened at those words, a feeling he could not immediately name but recognized as significant enough to warrant his personal attention rather than delegation to a subordinate. He gave the order that same afternoon, instructing that the woman be held, unharmed, until he could arrive to assess the situation himself. The ride to the southern camp took most of the following day, and Chaol spent much of it in silence, turning over the possibilities in his mind with the same careful attention he gave to matters of war and territory. A person without scent was not something his experience had prepared him for, and Chaol Draven did not enjoy encountering problems his experience had not prepared him for. Ines had insisted on accompanying him, citing concerns about leaving the throne unattended even briefly during heightened tensions with Fenwick, though Chaol suspected her true motivation had more to do with curiosity about what exactly had drawn her usually unshakable king into personal involvement over a simple case of camp theft. "You could simply have her released or punished according to camp policy," Ines pointed out as their horses climbed the final ridge before the camp came into view. "There was no need for you to travel here personally." Chaol did not look away from the path ahead. "If she is what the report suggests, then I want to see this for myself before deciding anything." "And what exactly does the report suggest to you?" Ines asked, her tone carrying the particular patience of someone who had asked her king a direct question and fully expected, this time, to receive a direct answer. Chaol considered the question for a long moment before responding, his gaze fixed on the smoke rising faintly from the camp's cooking fires in the distance. "It suggests," he said finally, "that whatever destroyed that village in the north may have left behind more than footprints that disappeared into rocky hills." And if that is true, I intend to understand exactly how and exactly what that means for the woman who managed it. Alara sat on a low wooden bench inside a supply tent, her wrists bound loosely in front of her, not out of cruelty but out of caution, as Roran had explained when the ropes were first tied. The overseer had been firm but not unkind during the questioning, asking simple questions about where Alara had come from and why she had chosen that particular camp to steal from. Questions Alara answered as vaguely as she dared, without drawing further suspicion. She had expected punishment, perhaps a beating or a period of forced labor to repay the stolen bread, the sort of consequence she had heard described in stories about border camps run by harsh overseers. What she had not expected was the sudden shift in atmosphere that arrived 2 days later, when word spread through the camp that the king himself was riding in to see her personally. The tent flap opened, and Alara's breath caught somewhere in her chest as a man stepped through, tall enough that he had to duck slightly beneath the canvas frame, his presence filling the small space in a way that had nothing to do with his height and everything to do with something harder to name. He wore simple dark clothing without any of the ornamentation she might have expected from a king, and his eyes, when they found hers, held an intensity that made her want to look away and made it impossible to do so at the same time. He said nothing at first, simply studying her the way someone might study a puzzle laid out on a table, and Alara found the silence far more unsettling than any shouted accusation could have been. Behind him stood a sharp-eyed woman who watched the exchange with obvious curiosity, and Roran, the camp overseer, who remained near the tent entrance with her hands folded, clearly uncertain of her role now that her king had taken a personal interest in the matter. "You stole bread from my supply table," Kale said finally, his voice low and even, carrying none of the anger Alara had braced herself for. "I was hungry," Alara answered, deciding that honesty, at least about this much, could not make her situation any worse. "I did not think anyone would notice one loaf missing." Kale's expression did not change, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes. "My camp overseer noticed something else entirely," he said. "She tells me my wolves could not place your scent, that in all her years of service, she has never encountered a person who registered as nothing at all to a wolf's senses." Alara felt her stomach drop, the careful mask of calm she had been trying to maintain threatening to crack under the weight of his steady attention. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this moment might come eventually, that the ash trick could not protect her forever from someone determined enough to ask the right questions. Still, she had not expected the confrontation to come wrapped in this particular kind of quiet intensity, a king studying her like something worth understanding, rather than something worth punishing. "I do not know what you mean," she said, though her voice wavered enough to suggest otherwise. Kale took a step closer, close enough that Alara could see the faint gray flecks scattered through his dark eyes, close enough that she became suddenly and acutely aware of how thoroughly he was watching her, as though searching for something beneath the surface of her carefully composed expression. "I have hunted people my entire life," he said, his voice dropping lower still. "I know the scent of fear, of exhaustion, of someone who has run a very long way from something terrible. And yet I catch none of it from you, not even now, not even standing this close. That is either the strangest coincidence I have encountered in years, or it is something you have done deliberately." Alara's mind raced through possible responses, each one feeling more inadequate than the last. She could deny everything and hope he grew bored of the mystery, could invent some story about a rare illness that dulled her scent, could simply refuse to speak at all and let silence do the work her words could not. In the end, exhaustion and fear won out over careful strategy, and something close to the truth slipped out before she could stop it. "There is an old trick," she said quietly, her eyes dropping to the ropes around her wrists. "Ash, mixed with certain herbs. My grandmother taught it to me. It hides a person's scent from anyone who might be hunting them." The tent fell silent, except for the faint sound of wind against canvas outside. Kale's expression remained largely unreadable, though Alara thought she caught something shift behind his eyes, something between satisfaction and a deeper, more careful curiosity. "And why?" he asked slowly. "Would a young woman need to hide from wolves badly enough to learn such a trick?" Alara's throat tightened, memories of the burning village rising unbidden and unwelcome, the sound of her grandmother's voice telling her to run, the smell of smoke that had followed her for weeks afterward no matter how far she traveled. She was not ready to share that story with anyone, least of all a stranger who held complete power over whatever happened to her next. "That is my business," she said, more sharply than she intended, "and not yours." Something almost like amusement crossed Kale's face then, quick and fleeting, gone before Alara could fully register it. Most people in your position do not speak to me that way, he said. Most people in my position have not lost everything already, Alara answered, her voice steadier now despite the tears threatening at the edges of her vision. There is very little left for you to take from me that would frighten me more than what I have already survived. The words hung in the air between them, and Kale studied her for a long moment before finally turning to Roran, who straightened immediately under his attention. Release her, he said. She will not be punished for the bread. Roran's surprise was evident, though she moved quickly to untie the ropes around Alara's wrists without questioning the order aloud. Ines, the sharp-eyed woman who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, stepped forward with an expression that suggested she had several questions of her own that she was choosing, for the moment, not to voice. Kale turned back to Alara, who rubbed absently at her freed wrists, watching him with a wary uncertainty that she made no effort to hide. I have a use for someone who can move through the world without leaving a scent behind, he said. Come to the castle. You will be given work, food, and shelter. In exchange, I ask only that you remain within Ashwood walls where I can find you if I need you. Alara stared at him, trying to determine whether this was truly the offer it appeared to be, or some more complicated trap disguised as kindness. And if I refuse, she asked. Then you are free to leave this camp and continue however you were surviving before, Kale said simply. I do not force people into my service, but I suspect, given the state you arrived in, that my offer is a considerably better option than whatever alternative you have been managing on your own. The practical part of Alara's mind, the part that had kept her alive through weeks of hunger and exhaustion, recognized immediately that he was right. She had no ash left beyond a few days' worth, no clear plan beyond simply continuing to move, and no guarantee that the next camp she encountered would treat her with anything close to the strange consideration this king had just shown her. Still, accepting his offer meant remaining close to a wolf whose senses had already noticed something unusual about her, remaining within reach of someone whose curiosity, she suspected, would not simply fade away once she disappeared into castle life as an ordinary servant. It was a risk, but every option available to her carried risk in one form or another, and this particular risk came attached to walls, food, and safety that her wandering alone through the hills could never provide. I will come, she said finally, and something in Kale's expression settled, as though a decision he had already privately made had simply been confirmed rather than granted. Good, he said, and turned to leave the tent without further explanation, leaving Ines behind to arrange the practical details of Alara's transport to the castle. Ines studied Alara for a long moment after Kale had gone, her expression thoughtful rather than suspicious. In all my years serving this throne, she said eventually, I have never once seen him take a personal interest in anyone the way he has taken one in you. I do not yet know what to make of that, and I suspect neither do you. Alara said nothing, unsure herself what to make of any of it, and followed Ines out of the tent into the gray afternoon light, uncertain whether she had just found the safety she desperately needed, or simply traded one kind of danger for another she did not yet fully understand. The castle at Ashwood was larger and colder than anything Alara had imagined during her weeks of wandering, its gray stone corridors stretching in every direction like a maze designed to swallow anyone unfamiliar with its layout. She was given a small room near the servants' quarters, sparse but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the training yards where warriors practiced from early morning until dusk. Ines had taken it upon herself to oversee Alara's introduction to castle life, assigning her to work under a kind but no-nonsense head servant named Talia, who managed the kitchens and the general upkeep of the eastern wing. Talia asked no questions about Alara's past, seeming to understand instinctively that the newest addition to her staff carried burdens better left unspoken, and Alara found herself grateful for that unspoken kindness more than she could express. Her days settled into a careful rhythm within the first week. She rose before dawn to help prepare the morning meals, spent mornings cleaning and organizing the eastern wing's many rooms, and used quiet afternoon hours to search the castle's herb gardens for anything resembling bitterroot, the crucial ingredient in her grandmother's ash mixture that had grown increasingly scarce during her travels. She found a small patch of something similar growing near the edge of the garden wall, close enough in appearance and scent to bitterroot that she decided, after careful testing, it would serve well enough as a substitute. Each morning before her duties began, she retreated to a quiet corner near the laundry room and reapplied the mixture to her skin, a ritual that had become as automatic as breathing, though the reasons behind it remained a secret she guarded as carefully as her own life. It was during her second week at the castle that she first became aware of how frequently she encountered the king in places that seemed, on the surface, like simple coincidence. He appeared in the training yards when she carried linens past on her way to the laundry room, walked through the kitchen corridors just as she finished helping prepare the evening meal, stood near the herb garden on more than one occasion when she slipped away to gather her ingredients. At first, she told herself these encounters meant nothing, that a castle of this size naturally brought its occupants into contact with one another regardless of intention. But as the pattern continued, growing more frequent rather than less, Elara began to suspect that Chaol Draven's presence in her daily path was rather less accidental than it appeared. She caught him watching her directly on several occasions, his expression carefully neutral but his attention unmistakable, and each time she felt a strange mixture of unease and something else she could not quite name, something warmer and more unsettling than simple fear. She reminded herself firmly, during these moments, exactly what he was, exactly what his kind had done to her village, and forced herself to look away before the warmth could take root into anything more dangerous. Talia noticed the pattern too, though she said nothing directly, offering instead small observations disguised as casual comments while they worked together in the kitchen. The king does not usually walk through these corridors so often, she mentioned one afternoon, kneading dough with practiced hands. He must have taken a particular interest in overseeing the Eastern Wing's upkeep lately. Elara kept her eyes on her own work, cutting vegetables with more focus than the task strictly required. Perhaps he simply has more free time than usual, she offered, though even she did not believe the explanation as she said it. Talia's only response was a knowing look and a small, private smile that suggested she understood exactly what was happening, even if she was too tactful to say so directly. The most direct encounter came nearly 3 weeks into Elara's time at the castle, during an evening when she had lingered longer than usual in the training yards, watching the warriors practice their formations under the last light of the setting sun. She had told herself she was simply taking a moment to rest before returning to her duties, but some honest part of her recognized that she had lingered specifically because Chaol was among those training, moving through combat drills with a controlled precision that held her attention far longer than she intended to allow. He noticed her watching partway through the session, and rather than continuing as though he had not seen her, he broke away from his warriors and crossed the yard directly toward where she stood near the fence line. Elara's instinct was to retreat, to disappear back into the castle before he could reach her, but something kept her feet planted where they were, some combination of curiosity and stubborn pride that refused to let her flee like a frightened animal. "You watch the training often," he observed, coming to a stop close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "I find it interesting," she said honestly. "I have never seen warriors train so precisely before." "Precision is what keeps warriors alive," Chaol said. "Emotion in a fight gets people killed. Discipline is the only thing that consistently does not." Elara considered this for a moment, something about the statement striking her as more revealing than he perhaps intended. "And is that why you rarely speak?" she asked, emboldened by weeks of relative safety within these walls. "Discipline, rather than simply having nothing to say." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by something more thoughtful. "Most people assume my silence means I am either angry or plotting something," he said. "Few have asked directly what it actually means." "And what does it mean?" Elara pressed, surprising herself with her own boldness. Chaol was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made it impossible to do so. "Words spoken carelessly can start wars," he said finally. "Silence, chosen deliberately, has kept more peace in this territory than any treaty I have signed. I learned long ago that most people fill silence with their own assumptions, and those assumptions often serve me better than anything I could say aloud." Elara found herself unexpectedly moved by the honesty of the answer, an honesty she had not anticipated from someone in his position. "That seems like a lonely way to live," she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could reconsider them. Something shifted in Chaol's expression then, a brief crack in the careful composure he maintained so consistently. "Perhaps," he admitted, "though I have found, recently, that loneliness feels somewhat less absolute than it used to." The words hung between them, heavier with meaning than either of them seemed entirely comfortable acknowledging directly. Elara felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away first, suddenly aware of how close they stood, how long they had lingered in this conversation compared to the brief exchanges she had expected from a king known throughout his territory for saying as little as possible. "I should return to my duties," she said, taking a careful step backward. Chaol did not stop her, though his eyes followed her retreat across the yard with an attention that she could feel even without turning to confirm it. As she disappeared back into the castle corridors, Elara pressed a hand against her chest, trying to steady the unexpected rhythm of her own heartbeat, unsettled by how easily this quiet, careful king had managed to unsettle the careful walls she had built around herself since the night her village burned. She reminded herself again, more firmly this time, exactly what stood between them, exactly what his kind represented in the story of her own survival. But even as she repeated the reminder, some quieter part of her recognized that the walls she had built were not quite as solid as she needed them to be, not anymore. Not after weeks of watching a king who ruled through silence choose, again and again, to break that silence specifically for her. Word travels quickly through castle walls, faster and more freely than most rulers ever fully appreciate, and within a month of Alara's arrival, whispers about the king's unusual attention toward the scentless servant girl had spread from the kitchens to the training yards, to the noble chambers where Ashwood's most influential families gathered to discuss matters of politics and inheritance. Alara first became aware of just how far the rumors had spread when Talia pulled her aside one morning before the kitchen staff arrived, her expression tighter with worry than Alara had seen it in weeks. "There is talk among the nobles," Talia said quietly, glancing toward the corridor as though someone might be listening even in the empty kitchen. "Some of them believe you are a spy, sent by a rival pack to gain the king's trust and learn our defenses from within. Others believe something else entirely. Something about the king's interest in you that has nothing to do with spying at all." Alara felt her stomach tighten with a familiar, cold dread. "What do they intend to do about it?" she asked. "I do not know for certain," Talia admitted. "But Lady Nessa has been gathering support among the noble houses, arguing that you should be questioned formally, perhaps even removed from the castle entirely, before the situation grows more complicated. She has never approved of the king's independence from noble influence, and she sees this as an opportunity to reassert some control." The warning settled uneasily in Alara's chest as she went about her duties that day, aware for the first time of eyes following her more closely than usual, aware of conversations that fell silent as she passed by rather than continuing naturally. She had grown comfortable, perhaps too comfortable, within the routine safety of castle life, and this sudden reminder of how precarious her position truly remained left her feeling exposed in a way she had not experienced since her first days of hiding in the mountains. She considered, briefly, simply leaving before matters could escalate further, slipping away in the early hours before anyone noticed her absence, and returning to the wandering existence she had maintained before arriving here. But something held her in place, a stubborn refusal to be chased away again, combined with a reluctance to abandon the fragile sense of belonging she had begun building within these walls, however complicated that belonging had become. The confrontation she feared arrived not from Lady Nessa directly, but from Cale himself, who summoned her to a private study late one evening after the rest of the castle had settled into quiet. Alara arrived with her heart hammering, uncertain whether she was about to be dismissed, questioned, or something else entirely that she had not yet considered. Cale stood near a window overlooking the darkened training yards, his back to the door when she entered, though he turned to face her almost immediately, his expression carrying none of the anger she had braced herself for. "There are concerns among my council regarding your presence here," he said without preamble, his directness somehow more unsettling than gentler phrasing might have been. "Some believe you pose a risk to Ashwood's security. I would like to hear, directly from you, whether there is any truth to that concern." Alara's hands twisted together in front of her, her mind racing through possible responses, weighing honesty against the careful self-protection that had kept her alive for months. "I am not a spy," she said finally, the words coming out steadier than she felt inside. "I have never worked for any pack, rival or otherwise. Everything I have told you about myself has been true, even if I have not told you everything there is to tell." Cale's eyes studied her carefully, searching for something in her expression that she could not identify. "Then tell me the rest," he said quietly. "Whatever you have been holding back. I would rather understand the full truth from you directly, than continue relying on rumors and half-formed theories from a council growing increasingly suspicious of what they do not understand." The invitation hung in the air between them, and Alara felt something crack open inside her chest, the careful walls she had maintained for so long suddenly feeling impossibly heavy to keep standing any longer. She thought of her grandmother, of the burning village, of months spent running and hiding and rationing ash against her skin like a lifeline she could not afford to lose. "There was a village," she began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "in the north. It was destroyed, burned, by wolves who were not interested in anything except killing everyone who lived there. My grandmother taught me the trick with the ash before she died protecting me, so that whatever hunted that night could never find me the way it found everyone else." Cale's expression shifted into something Alara had not seen from him before, a careful stillness that suggested he was processing information more significant than he had anticipated. "Which pack?" he asked quietly. Alara hesitated, some instinct warning her that naming Fenwick directly might complicate matters further than she could currently manage. might drag her fully into a political conflict she had been trying desperately to avoid since fleeing her home. "I do not wish to say more tonight," she said instead, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "Please, I have told you the truth about who I am and why I hide my scent. I ask that this be enough for now." Kale studied her for a long, silent moment, and Alara braced herself for further questioning, for demands she was not certain she could meet without breaking entirely. Instead, he simply nodded, something gentler than she expected settling into his expression. "That is enough for tonight," he said quietly. "I will handle my council's concerns myself. You need not carry that burden alone any longer than you already have." The relief that flooded through Alara at those words nearly buckled her knees, and she found herself blinking back tears she had not realized were gathering. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with an emotion she could not fully name. Kale took a step closer, close enough that Alara felt the familiar warmth of his presence settle around her like something almost protective. "You have survived something terrible," he said quietly. "I recognize the weight of that, even without knowing every detail yet. You do not need to carry it alone within these walls." The words settled into Alara's chest with a quiet, unexpected comfort, and for a moment, standing in the dim light of his private study, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to truly trust someone again, to lean on strength that was not her own for the first time since her grandmother's hand had released her wrist and pushed her toward the mountains. She left his study that evening with the immediate threat of council suspicions somewhat eased, though the deeper questions about her past, about Fenwick, about what exactly she owed this quiet king in exchange for his protection, remained unanswered and heavy in her mind as she made her way back through the darkened corridors toward her small room near the servants' quarters. Lady Nessa's suspicions, she understood, would not simply disappear because the king had chosen, for now, to trust her. And somewhere beyond these castle walls, the Fenwick pack that had destroyed everything she once knew, continued moving through the world, unaware that the last survivor of their destruction now lived within arm's reach of one of the most powerful wolves in the entire region. The messenger arrived at dawn, exhausted and covered in dust from hard riding, carrying news that spread through the castle within minutes of his arrival. An outlying village under Ashwood's protection had been struck overnight, buildings damaged and livestock scattered, though thankfully with fewer casualties than the attack that had destroyed Alara's own home months earlier. Alara heard the news while helping prepare the morning meal, and something cold and immediate settled into her stomach the moment Talia mentioned the direction the attackers had come from, and the particular pattern of destruction they had left behind. She set down the knife she had been using, and made her way toward the Great Hall before she had fully decided to do so, driven by an instinct she could not quite explain even to herself. Kale stood at the head of the war table when she arrived, surrounded by generals studying a map spread across the polished stone surface, marking the location of the attacked village with a small dark stone. His expression was harder than she had seen it before, focused entirely on the crisis at hand, and for a moment, Alara hesitated at the entrance, uncertain whether she had any right to intrude on this particular gathering. Garrett noticed her first, his expression questioning. "This is not a matter for castle staff," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "I may know something useful," Alara said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. Kale's eyes lifted from the map to find her, and something in his expression shifted from focused urgency to careful attention. "Let her speak," he said, and the room felt quiet enough that Alara felt the full weight of every gaze turning toward her. She stepped closer to the table, studying the map, the marked location, the direction of approach the generals had already traced based on scattered evidence at the scene. "The pattern they attack from the northeast first," she said slowly, memories she had tried desperately to forget rising unbidden to the surface. "They strike the outer buildings before the center of the village, driving people toward the well or the main square, where it is easier to trap them. And they always leave before sunrise, because their strength fades in daylight in a way they do not want their enemies to witness." The room remained silent for a long moment, several generals exchanging uncertain glances before Garrett spoke again, his tone more measured this time. "How do you know this?" Ilara's hands trembled slightly at her sides, though she forced herself to meet Kale's eyes rather than looking away. "Because I have seen it before," she said quietly. "In my own village. The pack that destroyed my home follows exactly this pattern, and I would recognize it anywhere." Kale studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes before he turned back to his generals with renewed focus. "Then we know considerably more than we did an hour ago," he said. "If this is indeed the same pack, we can predict their movements with far greater accuracy than our current information allows." The council session that followed stretched for hours, And to Alara's genuine surprise, Kale insisted she remain present throughout the planning, asking her direct questions about details she remembered from that terrible night. Details about timing and formation and behavior that none of his trained scouts could have known. She found herself providing information she had not consciously realized she still carried, memories surfacing with a clarity that left her shaken, even as they proved genuinely useful to the strategy taking shape around the war table. By the following morning, Kale had assembled a force to pursue the attackers before they could strike again, and to the shock of several generals, he announced that Alara would accompany the campaign as an advisor, her knowledge of the enemy's patterns deemed too valuable to leave behind at the castle. "This is highly irregular," Ines said privately to Kale as preparations were finalized, her tone carrying genuine concern rather than simple objection. "She is untrained, unfamiliar with the dangers of an active campaign, and her presence puts her at considerable risk." "Her presence may also save the lives of everyone in that force," Kale replied evenly. "I trust her instincts on this matter more than I trust the guesswork of scouts operating without her particular experience." Alara, listening from just outside the doorway where she had paused before entering, felt something warm bloom in her chest at those words, a feeling she recognized, uncomfortably, as trust returned in full for the trust she had extended to him weeks earlier in his private study. She had spent months believing that her survival depended entirely on remaining hidden, unremarkable, invisible to anyone who might recognize what she truly was. Standing now at the edge of a war council that valued her knowledge enough to risk her safety alongside their own, she felt something shift inside her, a realization that hiding had never been the same thing as safety, not truly, not in the way that mattered. The campaign moved swiftly once underway, Kale's forces tracking the attacking pack's movements, using the patterns Alara had described, closing the distance between them and their target with an efficiency that impressed even the most skeptical generals. Alara rode near the rear of the formation, uncomfortable in the saddle after months without regular riding, but determined not to slow the pace or draw unnecessary attention to her own limitations. Kale found moments throughout the journey to ride alongside her, checking on her welfare with a directness that she had come to recognize as his particular way of expressing concern, since flowery words did not come naturally to him even when his intentions clearly did. "You do not need to prove anything by enduring discomfort silently," he told her during one such moment, noting the way she shifted uncomfortably after hours in the saddle. "If you need rest, say so." "I am managing," Alara said, though her tired smile suggested the effort required to maintain that composure. Kale studied her for a moment longer before responding. "You have already given more to this campaign than anyone expected from you," he said quietly. "There's no shame in acknowledging your limits alongside your strengths." The words settled into Alara with an unexpected warmth, a recognition that felt different from anything she had experienced in her months of careful, guarded survival. She had spent so long believing that vulnerability meant danger, that admitting weakness invited destruction, and yet here was a king, known throughout his territory for unshakable discipline, gently reminding her that acknowledging limits was not the same thing as failure. They made camp that evening near the edge of a wide river, the water running high and fast after recent rains further upstream, and Alara found herself watching the current with a growing unease she could not quite name, some instinct warning her that crossing that particular obstacle the following day would bring changes she was not yet prepared to face. She did not yet know how right that instinct would prove to be, nor how completely the careful secret she had guarded for so long was about to slip away from her grasp the moment the river's current pulled the ash from her skin and revealed, at last, exactly what a king's patient wolf had been waiting to recognize. The river crossing began at first light, the water running colder and faster than it had appeared the evening before, swollen further by rains that had fallen somewhere upstream during the night. Kale had ordered the crossing done carefully, warriors moving in small groups with ropes strung between the banks to prevent anyone from being swept away by the current, and Alara found herself waiting near the rear of the formation, watching group after group make the crossing safely ahead of her. When her turn finally came, she gripped the rope with both hands, her heart pounding as the cold water rose to her waist, then her chest, the current pulling harder against her than she had anticipated from the shore. She focused entirely on maintaining her grip, on placing one foot carefully in front of the other against the rocky riverbed, and did not notice, in the chaos of the crossing, the way the water worked steadily against the careful layer of ash she had applied that morning. A sudden surge in the current knocked her briefly off balance, and though she recovered quickly, gripping the rope tightly enough to prevent herself from being swept downstream, the moment of struggle left her fully submerged for several seconds, the cold water rushing across every inch of exposed skin. By the time she reached the far bank, shivering and soaked, She had no way of knowing that the ash protecting her secret for months had washed away entirely, carried off by the very river that had just tested her survival in an entirely different way. Cale reached the far bank shortly after her, his attention immediately drawn to her shivering form, as warriors helped pull her fully onto dry ground. He moved toward her without hesitation, some protective instinct overriding the careful distance he usually maintained in front of his generals, and as he drew close enough to offer assistance, something shifted entirely in his expression, a stillness settling over his features that had nothing to do with concern for her physical safety. His wolf, silent and patient for months despite every opportunity to catch even a trace of her true scent, suddenly caught something it had been waiting, without his fully conscious awareness, to recognize. The scent that reached him now, faint but unmistakable beneath the fresh rainwater and cold river current, matched something buried deep in his memory, something from that burned village in the north, from footprints that had disappeared into rocky hills months earlier. Ilara noticed the change in his expression immediately, the way his careful composure seemed to crack open around something he had not expected to encounter, and cold dread settled through her chest even before he spoke a single word. "Your scent," Cale said quietly, his voice carrying a rough edge she had never heard from him before. "I recognize it now." Ilara's hands flew instinctively to her arms, as though she could somehow undo the river's work and restore the protective ash that had washed away during the crossing. Panic rose in her throat, sharp and immediate, though beneath that panic ran something else, a strange and unexpected relief at no longer having to maintain the exhausting effort of complete concealment. "I can explain," she began, though she was not entirely certain what explanation she intended to offer. Cale held up a hand, not harshly, but firmly enough that she fell silent immediately. "That village in the north," he said slowly, piecing together the realization even as he spoke it aloud. "The one my forces investigated months ago, before you ever arrived at my southern camp. There were footprints leaving the wreckage, footprints that disappeared entirely once they reached the rocky hills beyond the village. I sent a scout to search on discreet watch afterward, curious whether the survivor might resurface somewhere within my territory." Ilara's breath caught in her throat, understanding dawning slowly and painfully across her expression. "You knew," she whispered. "Before I ever explained anything to you in your study, you already suspected." "I suspected there was more to your story than simple theft and simple secrets," Cale said. "I did not know for certain until this moment, standing here, catching your scent for the first time since that burned village. But something in me recognized you long before today, even when I could not fully explain why." The other warriors nearby had given them a wide berth once the tension of the exchange became evident, and Ilara found herself standing alone with Cale at the edge of the riverbank, soaked and shivering, her carefully guarded secret finally, completely exposed. "That was your territory," she said slowly, working through the implications even as she spoke them aloud. "The village that burned. It was close enough to Ashwood borders that you considered its destruction a trespass against your own lands." Cale nodded slowly. It was not part of Ashwood territory directly, but close enough that Fenwick's aggression there confirmed exactly how far they intended to push before someone finally pushed back. The name Fenwick, spoken aloud for the first time in Ilara's presence since the night everything burned, sent a fresh wave of cold through her chest, despite the warmth of the sun now drying her soaked clothing. "You know who destroyed my village," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have suspected for some time," Cale admitted. "The pattern you described to my council, the timing, the formation, everything matched what my scouts already reported about Fenwick's tactics along our shared border. I did not want to confirm it aloud until I understood fully how much you already knew, and how much more you were still hiding." Ilara felt something crack open inside her chest at those words, a mixture of relief and fresh grief, and something else entirely that she could not yet name, standing here, with the truth finally laid bare between them after months of careful concealment. She had spent so long believing that revealing her true scent meant certain danger, that being found meant being destroyed the way her village had been destroyed. And yet here stood the wolf who had finally found her, not with anger or threat, but with something closer to quiet, careful understanding. "I am sorry," Cale said, his voice softer now than she had ever heard it, "for not telling you sooner that I suspected who you were. I did not want to press you before you were ready to share it yourself." Ilara studied him for a long moment, the cold water still dripping from her hair, the weight of months of careful hiding finally beginning to lift from her shoulders even as fresh uncertainty took its place. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Cale's expression remained steady, though something gentler moved behind his eyes. "Now," he said, "we finish what we started. We find the pack that destroyed your home, And we ensure they never threaten anyone else the way they threatened you and everyone you loved." The words offered a kind of comfort Alara had not expected to feel, standing exposed and vulnerable at the edge of a river that had stripped away the last of her careful protection. For the first time since fleeing her burning village, she felt less like someone hiding from a fate she could not escape, and more like someone standing, finally, on the edge of confronting it directly, with someone beside her who understood exactly what that confrontation would cost. The campaign pressed onward for 3 more days following the river crossing, Cale's forces closing steadily on the retreating Fenwick scouts who had struck the outlying village, and Alara found herself riding closer to Cale now rather than lingering at the rear of the formation, the careful distance between them, replaced by something new and still uncertain following the revelation at the riverbank. They caught the Fenwick scouting party on the 4th morning, cornering them in a narrow valley before they could retreat further into contested territory. The confrontation was brief and decisive, Cale's disciplined forces overwhelming the smaller group with practiced efficiency, and within an hour, the immediate threat to the outlying village had been neutralized entirely, several scouts captured for questioning rather than left to continue their aggression unchecked. Alara stood at a careful distance during the confrontation, her heart hammering with memories she could not fully suppress, the sight of Fenwick markings on captured warriors' clothing bringing back the burning village, with a vividness that left her hands trembling long after the fighting had ended. Cale noticed her distress immediately, crossing the clearing to stand beside her once the captured scouts had been secured. "You do not have to watch this," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I needed to see it," Alara answered, her voice steadier than she felt inside. "I needed to see that they are not invincible, that the thing that destroyed my home can be stopped, can be captured, can be made to answer for what it has done." Cale studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "When we return to the castle," he said carefully, "I will need you to identify, if you can bear it, whether any of these scouts were present the night your village burned. Their testimony, combined with your own account, would give us grounds to move against Fenwick directly, rather than simply responding to isolated incidents along the border." The request settled heavily into Alara's chest, and she nodded slowly, understanding the necessity even as dread coiled tight within her at the thought of confronting, directly, the faces that might have watched her grandmother die. The journey back to the castle felt longer than the journey out had been, weighted now with the knowledge of what awaited her upon arrival, and Alara found herself increasingly quiet during the final days of travel, retreating into memories she had spent months trying desperately to outrun. Cale respected her silence, though his presence remained close, a steady, watchful comfort that she found herself leaning on more than she had expected to allow. The identification, when it finally came, proved worse than Alara had anticipated. Standing in a cold stone chamber beneath the castle, facing 3 captured Fenwick scouts under careful guard, she recognized immediately the scarred features of one particular warrior, a face burned into her memory from that terrible night despite months of trying to forget it. "He was there," she said, her voice barely steady, pointing toward the scarred warrior. "He was one of the ones who set fire to the eastern houses. I remember his face from the light of the flames." The scout's expression twisted into something cruel and mocking upon hearing her words. "Plenty of houses burned that night, girl," he said, his voice carrying a casual malice that made Alara's stomach turn. Hard to remember one face among so many when there was so much else to watch burning. Cale's expression darkened immediately, though he maintained enough control to address the scout with cold precision rather than open anger. "You will answer formally for that night, along with everything else your pack has done along this border," he said. "Take him back to the holding cells." Once the guards had removed the scouts from the chamber, Alara found herself trembling uncontrollably, the careful composure she had maintained throughout the identification finally breaking apart entirely. Cale moved to her side immediately, his hands steady on her shoulders, as he guided her toward a bench along the chamber wall. "That is enough for today," he said gently. "You have given us exactly what we needed." Alara pressed her hands against her face, tears finally spilling free after months of careful restraint. "I can still smell the smoke sometimes," she whispered. "Even now, even here, safe within these walls. I do not know if that feeling will ever fully leave me." Cale sat beside her, close enough that his presence offered warmth without demanding anything further from her in that moment. "It may not," he said honestly, his directness somehow more comforting than false reassurance would have been. "But you do not have to carry it entirely alone. Not anymore." The words should have offered comfort, and in some ways they did, but they also brought a fresh and unexpected wave of fear crashing over Alara as she considered exactly what accepting that comfort would mean. She thought of her grandmother's warnings about wolves, about scent and vulnerability, and the danger of ever being fully found by something powerful enough to consume her entirely if it chose to. She thought about how completely she had already been found, how thoroughly her careful protections had failed, and how frightened that failure left her despite the gentleness with which Cale had responded to it. That evening, alone in her small room, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on Alara with a suffocating intensity she had not experienced since the night her village burned. She thought of Lady Nessa's suspicions, of the captured scout's cruel mockery, of Cale's steady, patient understanding that somehow felt more terrifying than any threat could have been, because it asked something of her that she was not certain she knew how to give. Being found, truly found, by something as powerful as the Alpha King, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff she had spent months carefully avoiding. And as the night deepened around her small room, panic finally overtook the careful control she had maintained throughout the long campaign. She gathered what little she owned into a small bag, retrieved the last remnants of her ash mixture from where she had hidden it, and slipped out into the darkened castle corridors before she could fully reconsider the decision taking shape within her. She told herself as she moved silently through the sleeping castle toward the outer gates that this was simply another act of survival, the same instinct that had carried her safely through months of dangerous wandering. But some quieter, more honest part of her recognized that she was not running from danger this time. She was running from the terrifying possibility of finally, truly being safe, and from everything that safety might eventually ask her to risk in return. The castle stirred to unusual activity well before dawn, word spreading quickly among the servants that the scentless girl who had accompanied the king's campaign had disappeared sometime during the night. Talia discovered the empty room first, the narrow bed untouched, the small collection of belongings Alara had gathered during her months at the castle, noticeably absent from their usual places. Cale received the news with a stillness that unsettled everyone around him more than open anger would have, his expression carefully composed even as something sharp and urgent moved behind his eyes. He gave orders quickly and efficiently, instructing his most trusted scouts to search the surrounding roads and villages, though he insisted, firmly, that he would lead the primary search himself. Ines attempted to counsel patience, pointing out that the girl had clearly chosen to leave of her own accord, and might need time to reconsider that decision without additional pressure from an immediate pursuit. Cale listened to the argument with visible effort at maintaining his usual careful patience, though his response carried an edge sharper than his advisors had grown accustomed to hearing from him. "She has spent months learning how to disappear from anyone hunting her," he said. "If I wait even a single day, whatever advantage I might have in finding her again will be lost entirely." He rode out alone shortly after receiving the news, ignoring Ines's continued concerns about traveling without proper escort. His focus narrowed entirely onto the problem of finding someone who had, quite deliberately, made herself impossible to track by scent. He considered the challenge as he rode, drawing on months of careful observation rather than the senses that had failed him for so long regarding her true nature. He knew, from patient months of watching her, that Alara did not simply flee blindly when frightened. She had survived this long precisely because she thought carefully, even in moments of panic, choosing paths that offered both concealment and eventual safety, rather than simply running in whatever direction fear pointed her. He remembered her description of the cave behind the waterfall where she had first hidden after her village burned, a place her grandmother had specifically prepared her to retreat toward in moments of crisis. It was a considerable distance from the castle, further than he expected she could travel on foot within a single night, but something in his instincts insisted that a place representing safety and familiar comfort would draw her more powerfully than any random direction chosen out of pure panic. He turned his horse toward the northern hills, trusting a calculation built entirely on understanding rather than scent. He found her just after midday, sitting at the edge of a small stream not far from where the terrain began climbing toward the rockier hills further north. Fresh ash smeared hastily across her arms and neck in a desperate attempt to restore the protection she had lost during the river crossing days earlier. She heard his approach before she saw him, her body tensing immediately, though she did not run, some exhaustion or resignation keeping her rooted in place as he dismounted and approached slowly. "You found me," she said quietly, not turning to face him directly. "Not through scent," Cale said, coming to a stop a respectful distance away. "Through understanding you well enough to guess where you might go." Alara finally turned to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted, though something in her expression suggested relief mixed uncomfortably with continued fear. "That should frighten me more than anything else you could have done," she said, "that you know me well enough to find me even when I hide my scent completely." Cale lowered himself carefully to sit on a nearby rock, maintaining distance while still remaining close enough for conversation. Why does it frighten you? He asked gently. I am not the wolf who destroyed your home. I never intended to hunt you the way something else once hunted your entire village. I know that, Alara said, her voice cracking slightly. And that is exactly what frightens me. My grandmother taught me that being found by a wolf meant destruction. She never taught me what to do if being found meant something else entirely, something I do not know how to trust because I have never had reason to trust it before. Kale was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully before speaking. My father once told me that true strength was not measured by what a person could conquer, but by what a person chose to protect, he said finally. I have spent years believing that meant protecting territory, protecting my people, protecting the throne my family fought to secure. I did not expect, until recently, that it might also mean protecting someone specific, someone whose safety mattered to me in a way that had nothing to do with territory or duty at all. Ilara's breath caught at the quiet honesty in his words, and she found herself unable to look away from him despite every instinct urging her to retreat further into careful, guarded distance. You are asking me to trust something my entire life has taught me to fear, she said softly. I am asking you to consider that perhaps not everything that finds you intends to destroy you, Kale answered. I cannot promise you a life free of danger. Fenwick remains a threat, and the world beyond these hills remains as complicated and difficult as it has ever been. But I can promise that I do not intend to be another source of that danger in your life. I would rather be the reason you finally feel safe enough to stop running. The words settled into Alara with a weight she had not expected, cutting through months of careful self-protection, with a gentleness that felt somehow more powerful than any demand could have been. She thought of her grandmother's final act, pushing her toward safety even at the cost of her own life, and wondered, for the first time, whether her grandmother's deepest wish had truly been for Alara to spend the rest of her days alone and hidden, or simply for her to survive long enough to find something worth trusting again. I do not know how to stop being afraid, she admitted quietly, tears slipping freely down her cheeks now. You do not have to stop all at once, Kale said, his voice gentle in a way that few beyond these hills had ever heard from him. You only have to choose, each day, whether you want to keep running or whether you want to try staying instead. I am not asking for certainty. I am only asking for the chance to prove that staying might be worth the risk. Ilara studied him for a long moment, the exhaustion of months finally catching up with her all at once, and something inside her, some tightly wound thread that had held her together since the night her village burned, finally began to loosen. She rose slowly from where she sat, crossing the short distance between them, and Kale rose to meet her, his expression careful and patient, offering nothing but quiet presence rather than any demand for immediate resolution. I want to try staying, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, but steadier than it had been and longer than she could remember. Kale's expression softened into something Alara had never seen from him before, something warm and unguarded that transformed his usually careful features entirely. Then let us go home, he said quietly, offering his hand rather than any command, and Alara, after a long moment of hesitation, finally took it. The ride back to the castle passed in a quiet that felt entirely different from the tense silences that had marked so much of their earlier journey together. Something settled and steady, replacing the uncertainty that had followed Ilara since the night her secret finally came undone. Kale rode close beside her the entire way, offering conversation when she wanted it, and comfortable silence when she needed that instead. And by the time the towers of Ashwood came into view against the afternoon sky, Ilara found herself feeling something she had not expected to feel again for a very long time. She felt, for the first time since the fire took everything she knew, something close to hope. Word of her return spread quickly through the castle, and Ilara noticed immediately the careful, curious glances following her through the corridors, servants and warriors alike aware that something significant had shifted during the days she had been away. Ines met them at the entrance to the great hall, her expression carrying obvious relief alongside a curiosity she made no effort to hide. I take it matters were resolved satisfactorily, Ines said, studying the two of them with sharp, knowing eyes. They were resolved honestly, Kale said, which Ines seemed to accept as answer enough for the moment. That evening, Kale called together his full council, an unusual gathering given the late hour, and Ilara found herself standing beside him at the head of the long stone table rather than waiting somewhere out of sight as she might have done in earlier weeks. Lady Nessa's expression carried obvious surprise at Ilara's prominent placement, though she said nothing yet, waiting to see what announcement had prompted such an unusual assembly. I have called you together, Kale began, his voice carrying the particular weight it always held when he intended his words to matter beyond the immediate moment, because I owe this council, and this entire territory, An honest account of who stands beside me tonight, rather than allowing rumor and suspicion to continue filling the silence I have kept regarding her presence here. He turned toward Alara, offering her a small, encouraging nod, and Alara understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her, that this moment belonged to her as much as to him. She drew a slow breath and addressed the assembled council directly, her voice carrying further than she expected it to across the quiet stone chamber. "My name is Alara Voss," she began. "Months ago, my village in the north was destroyed by the Fenwick pack, and I survived only because my grandmother taught me to hide my scent using ash and crushed herbs, a trick that kept me hidden from every wolf who might have hunted me since that night, including, for a considerable time, the wolves within these very walls." She continued, describing the burning village, her grandmother's sacrifice, the months of wandering that had eventually brought her to Ashwood's southern border camp, and finally, the slow unraveling of her careful secret that had led to this moment, standing exposed and honest before an entire council that had spent weeks suspecting her of far darker intentions than simple survival. "I did not come here to spy on anyone, or to threaten this throne in any way," she finished, her voice steady despite the weight of every eye fixed upon her. "I came here because I had nowhere else left to go, and I stayed because I found, within these walls, something I had stopped believing I would ever find again: safety. And eventually, something more than safety." The chamber remained silent for a long moment following her words, several council members exchanging glances that suggested genuine reassessment of everything they had previously assumed about her presence. Lady Nessa, to her credit, was the first to speak, her tone considerably softer than the suspicious accusations she had been quietly spreading for weeks. "That is a difficult truth to share before an entire council," she said. "I appreciate your honesty, even if I regret some of my earlier assumptions." Cale stepped forward then, his hand finding Alara's with a gentleness that drew soft murmurs of surprise from several council members. "This woman has survived what few could endure," he said, his voice carrying the full authority that had earned him his throne in the first place. "She has given this territory valuable knowledge that helped protect one of our outlying villages from further Fenwick aggression, and she has done so while carrying grief that most of us in this room can barely imagine. I do not intend to hide this partnership any longer, nor do I intend to allow suspicion to continue shadowing someone who has already given more to this territory's safety than many who have served it far longer." The announcement that followed, delivered with the same quiet directness that had defined Cale's entire reign, left little room for further debate among the assembled council. Alara Voss would remain at Ashwood not as a servant hiding in careful shadows, but as someone recognized publicly, for both her courage and her growing place beside the throne itself. In the weeks that followed, Ashwood moved decisively against Fenwick's continued aggression, using the intelligence Alara had provided alongside testimony from captured scouts, to justify a coordinated response that finally pushed the rival pack back from the borders they had spent months testing. Justice, when it came for the destruction of Alara's village, arrived not through personal vengeance, but through the same disciplined strength that had defined Cale's rule from the very beginning. A strength that finally extended its protection fully to the survivor who had once believed herself beyond anyone's ability to protect. Alara no longer applied ash to her skin each morning, the careful ritual that had defined so much of her survival, gradually fading into memory as trust, slowly and steadily, replaced fear as the foundation of her daily life. She kept the small leather pouch her grandmother had given her, not as a tool she still needed, but as a reminder of everything she had survived to reach this point, a memory of protection that had finally, gratefully, become unnecessary. On a clear autumn morning nearly a year after she had first stumbled, exhausted and starving, into a quiet border camp stealing bread from an unguarded table, Alara stood before the full gathering of Ashwood's people, as Cale formally recognized her place beside him, not simply as someone he protected, but as an equal partner in the strength that governed this territory. The wolves of Ashwood, gathered in their human forms across the courtyard, did not need scent to recognize what stood clearly before them. They saw a woman who had survived destruction, who had chosen courage over permanent hiding, and who now stood ready to help guide the same strength that had once found her in silence. Cale took her hand before the assembled crowd, his expression carrying none of the careful reserve he had maintained for so many years before her arrival. "A true alpha," he announced, his voice clear and steady across the quiet courtyard, "is not measured by what their senses can track, but by what their heart recognizes as worth protecting, worth honoring, and worth standing beside for the rest of their days. Alara Voss was never lost to me, even in the months I could not find her scent. She was simply waiting for someone patient enough and honest enough to find her silence instead. Ilara felt tears rise, warm and unguarded, as the crowd's quiet approval rose into something closer to genuine celebration. And standing there in the autumn light, finally fully seen after months of careful hiding, she understood at last what her grandmother's sacrifice had truly been meant to protect. Not a life spent forever running, forever hidden, forever alone, with grief too heavy to share, but a life that had, against every fear she carried, finally found its way toward safety, toward partnership, and toward a home worth being found in.